Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to take a look at practice 7.1 aggregate supply number 2. So this is the second basically of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply problem sets. And I'm so sorry about screwing this up. Just keep going through in order and we'll figure it out, right? I did add this YouTube video here. It's a good Jacob Clifford quick little review and see if that helps you a little bit. If you feel like you need a little practice before we dive into some practice ourselves. So the first thing is going to be a prompt, and then you're going to choose, is it IRAP, inflationary expectations, resource prices, actions by the government affecting producers, productivity, or no change? And then does short aggregate supply go up or down, or is it a decrease and increase and left and right? So Saudi Arabia reduces oil production. So thinking back, remember I told you if it's going to affect the cost of production. So oil going into almost anything, remember the pen example I gave you, is a resource cost, right? So we'd say resource cost, and we'd say if they reduce oil production, it's going to make oil more expensive, and so that makes cost of production going up. So we'd say aggregate supply decreases, and so it shifts to the left, right? And that's kind of a wonky arrow there. Businesses create worker training programs. Now, at first glance, you might think, I don't know, what does that do? What worker training? If I train my workers, now it's obviously going to cost a little bit to do that, but we wouldn't do that unless we really had some other purpose in training them, right? And so what's the ultimate goal of training them? Well, we train our workers to make them more productive. That's why we do it. And so assuming that they work, right, we'd say productivity. Productivity is the name of the game, and it's going to increase it and shift it to the right. So it's going to reduce the costs of production overall because your workers are more productive, so they're making more stuff per worker. And so we'd say aggregate supply increases. Government cuts on environmental regulations. That's going to cut the costs of production. So we'd say this is actions by the government affecting producers. It's going to increase aggregate supply and shift it to the right because it's making it cheaper to produce. Businesses expect higher inflation soon. So if businesses are expecting higher inflation soon, or even households are expecting higher inflation, the expectation matters, because what they'll do is they'll say, let's go ahead and raise our prices for the goods and services that we sell to other people. Well, what does that do? Well, it makes resources more expensive. So if you're a donut shop and your flour delivery company or your sugar delivery company says, hey, we think inflation's going up, so we're going to raise the price of sugar, and you make donuts, well, it makes it more expensive for you to make donuts, right? And so, your aggregate supply is going to decrease in the economy, so shift it to the left. Union membership decreases. Now, remember, I told you about one of the most important ones here is wages. And if we don't have as many people in unions, then their wages are going to be lower. If their wages are lower, that's a resource cost, right? Or an input price is another way to talk about that. Oh, this is not resources. That's silly. That's inflationary expectations. The previous one, inflationary expectations. And it affects resource prices. So that's kind of why I forgot about it, because almost all of these, right? We know that the inflationary expectations affect the resource prices, and the actions by the government affect resource prices. So realistically, there's only two shifters, but we can't be like IRAP, because otherwise this is RIP, if it's just RP. So we have IRAP so that we can make a nice kind of mnemonic out of it. Anyways, if the wages are going down, right, in this problem, union membership goes down, so wages go down. So we would say that the resources to produce are now cheaper, right? If you're a firm and you go, hooray, the wages are lower, so now we can make more stuff with the same amount of cost on the back end. So resources going down in price means aggregate supply goes up because we can produce more stuff and it shifts to the right. Fracking drives down energy costs. Again, this is one where it's the resource, right? Because it's talking about the input of energy prices. And if energy prices are lower, then it's cheaper to produce, so you can produce more. So it's less costly to produce. We see an increase in aggregate supply. Labor productivity rises. So that one's kind of obvious. That's a productivity shifter, right? And if it's more productive, if your workers are more productive, maybe you've trained them better, then we know that your aggregate supply will increase. Electricity prices go up due to a carbon tax. So this one, again, you could say, well, it's an action by the government that affects producers because it's carbon tax, but you could also just say it's a resource price, right? So I'm going to say resources because the clear indicator here is that the resource is the electricity. You use that to produce, and if it's more expensive to produce, we'd say there's a decrease in aggregate supply and a shift to the left. Job training programs go up in popularity. So if it's more popular to be trained, then we'd assume that probably those workers are more productive, right? Then you can kind of start to see the connection here. Productivity. And so we'd say it goes up and shifts to the right. Congress votes to expand immigration. Now, this one's tricky, really tricky. Think about if you have more workers, right? Think about you have more workers, more immigrants, and you're thinking about all of these things up here. Inflation expectations, nah, not really. But workers, well, we already established workers and wages. Now, there's some links in this chain here. There's links in this food chain, but bear with me. If you have more workers, right, then the wages are going to be held a little bit down. And the thinking that you have more workers, so the supply of workers is larger, so equilibrium wages will be lower. And if wages are lower, then resource prices are cheaper, and so it increases aggregate supply. That's the kind of link in the chain here. Now, there are some people, and in fact, last year I had a very bright young lady who's going off to college and going and studying all this stuff, who did research about the first link in that chain, like does more immigration actually affect wages? And they said, nah, yes and no. So sometimes, right, your mileage may vary. But if we just said, broadly, there's more workers, then the logical if then is that the wages will be held lower. And so we know that wages are an input cost. And so resource prices are now lower. And so aggregate supply goes up. So a lot of times we actually see businesses say things like, I want more immigrants, right? Well, why do they want immigrants? Because it makes it cheaper for them to produce. It makes it easier for them to produce. They can produce more with the same amount of resources, or it's just easier for them to do it. And so many times we see immigration kind of business being the pro-business position, being pro-immigration. Businesses invest in new machinery that increases the marginal product of labor. So at first glance, many students would fixate on invest in new machinery. And certainly if you just stop with that, then this isn't really aggregate supply at all, because it's investment spending. When they buy new machinery, that's aggregate demand. But the second part of the statement, increases the marginal product of labor. This part right here, that should key you in that this is productivity, right? It's how productive each worker is. And it's going up. And so aggregate supply would shift to the right because each worker now is more productive than they used to be. 12th, Congress votes to expand higher education to improve human capital. Now, what is this human capital? That's your worker training, right? It's the quality of your workforce, of your labor. So if you have more human capital, you have better quality labor. And so in theory, you're more productive, right? With more educated workers, they're more productive, and that increases aggregate supply. So another pro-business proposition is investing in education systems. A lot of times businesses want educated workers, right? They want very highly productive workers. Okay, now the second part of today's practice, and by the way, this is tough stuff. So if you're like still your mind is a little on it, do the practice, right? Watch this extra little quick video. It'll help. Now let's talk about the long run for a second here. And this is kind of a walk you through it scenario. Imagine Congress cuts business taxes on investing in new machinery and equipment. But we actually just talked about that right here. As a result, what component is affected? In fact, I think I just told you. So thinking about it, CIGXM, well, if it's new machinery and investing, it's investment spending. Now, if they respond by buying new machinery, what's the impact on productivity? Well, in fact, we actually got that answer right here. They invest in machinery that increases the marginal product of labor, so productivity is going to increase. And if productivity increases, how does short run aggregate supply? Well, duh, we've got a ton of these listed up here. If productivity goes up, short run aggregate supply will increase. And if it's permanent, right, how does long run increase? Well, it goes up, right? It increases. And so thinking through what might a long run question look like? Well, you could see how, you could have a question that would say, what happens to SRAS? Show that on a graph. Well, you just go, ta-da, shifts to the right, right? And then it would say, for this fourth question, it would say, now draw a PPC showing what that looks like. And here, and this was in the last video, I said, what would that look like? Well, they can shift that PPC out. If there is if LRAS increase, we'd say, therefore, PPC outward, right? So they're usually not going to ask you to draw the LRAS shifting to the right. right? They're not going to be like, hey, move that curve. They don't usually do this. They'll usually say in the short run, draw the graph, and then in the long run, they'll have you draw a different graph to show it. But they might, and if they do, you just move the line to the right. It's really not that hard. Okay, hopefully this practice helped you. See you next time.